So if you want to learn how to knit, then you have come to the right video. First of all, I'm so excited for you. I obviously love to knit and I love to encourage all of my friends to knit because it just brings me so much joy. Now, this video is not a tutorial. I'm not going to teach you how to knit. However, I'm going to give you all of the resources that you need in order to start out. I'm going to chat about needles, yarn, tutorials and skills that you need, and some good designers and easy beginner friendly patterns that you need to know about. And I'm also going to answer some questions right at the end of the video. The actual process of knitting is supposed to be very meditative whilst also being challenging. You're meant to have fun. It can be so good for your mental health, and in general, just learning a new skill, especially as an adult, is so invaluable. And let me tell you, learning to knit is way easier than learning a new language or an instrument. There isn't a right way to learn how to knit. There's multiple different ways to achieve the same result. So all the information I'm giving you is just about finding what works best for you. Now, the internet is a great place to learn a new skill, especially with knitting. However, it can also be incredibly overwhelming because there is literally millions of tutorials and articles on tips and tricks on how to knit, and sometimes that is just too much. Knitting especially is so easy and simple, and it sometimes gets unnecessarily overcomplicated. So let's break it down into some very easy steps. If you've literally never knit anything before, you've never picked up a pair of needles, I encourage you to find a cheap pair of needles and some yarn. You can ask your friends, your family, look in charity shops, thrift shops, and just get some cheap materials. Literally this weekend, me and my friends were doing a movie marathon, and my friend Hannah said that she's going to learn how to knit, and she borrowed a pair of needles from me, some yarn from my other friend Ella, and she sat down, watched a couple YouTube tutorials, and by the end of the day, she had knit a headband. Simple as that. There's only really 3 tutorials that you need in order to start out. You need to learn how to cast on, you need to learn the knit stitch, and you need to learn how to cast off. That is the 3 basics that you need to know in order to knit something. So if you don't know how to do these 3 things, then stop the video here, have a go, and come back to this video when you've had a bit more practice. If you do need a little bit more help and information, once you've kind of got the basics down, you've got all your materials ready, then let's dive straight in, and we're gonna start by talking about needles and notions. Okay, so there are 3 different types of needles. I actually only own one type and can only show you one in person, and that is circular needles. You can also get straight needles and double pointed needles. Just to overcomplicate it, all of these different needle types also come in different materials. The main 3 that I want to mention in this video is wood, plastic, and metal. Now, they all have their pros and cons, and it's all mostly down to personal preference and trying out different materials and seeing what you like working with. I like to work with metal because I come from a crochet background. I crocheted before I knit, and I'm used to the kind of metal plasticky feel of a crochet hook. In contrast, wooden needles are a lot less slippery, so some people recommend wooden needles for beginners because they grab the yarn fibers a lot more. However, they are quite prone to breaking, which can be quite frustrating, especially if you start out. But like I said, the best thing to do is to just try out different materials. Again, there's lots you can buy secondhand. Your local yarn stores will also most likely have different types of needles that you can try out, so you don't need to commit to ordering a whole bunch of needles in bulk just to then later find out that you don't actually like working with them. Then in terms of knitting types, I would generally tell beginners to avoid straight needles and instead use circular interchangeable needles. You also want to avoid super small sizes because it's just a lot harder to see your stitches. You kind of want to aim for needle sizes larger than 4.5 mil. I feel like generally 5 mil is a good starting size. So what are straight needles and why do I not recommend them for beginners? Straight needles can pretty much only be used for flat knitting, which as a beginner is absolutely fine. However, there's a limit of how many stitches you can have on the needles. They do come in different lengths, but they only go so long, and they can be quite difficult to hold. When you're working your needles, they kind of work in extension to your forearm, so you kind of have to move around a lot more. In contrast, circular needles are a lot shorter, and rather than working with your whole arm, they're more just working as an extension of your wrist. Circular needles are also the standard and most modern patterns and are used in round knitting, so oftentimes when you're knitting sleeves or anything really that has to go in the round. They also can hold a lot more more stitches than a straight pair. So when you get an interchangeable set, you can change out the cable that is in between them. So you can fit this amount of stitches on there. You can also get shorter cables, or you can get really long cables. I have this one which basically fits around my whole body. You can buy individual needles as well as sets of needles. So once you've kind of found a needle brand that you like, you can build your needle collection bit by bit, which is why I think it's important that the needles that you start using are interchangeable. You can get circular needles with the cable fixed onto them, but I think at that point you might as well just get the interchangeable ones, and then you don't have to buy the same size needles with different cables constantly. Third needle type is double pointed needles, and these are mostly used for smaller projects that are worked in the round. So if the kind of projects that you're planning to work on are socks, beanies, or kids clothing, then double pointed needles are going to be really important for those kind of projects and are probably worth getting some practice with. There's a bunch of other things and accessories that you can get. I just want to reiterate that as a complete beginner, you do not need these. However, some other things that are really handy to have is number one, a crochet hook. They're really helpful to have when you're picking up drop stitches, and you can also use them for seaming pieces together or for casting off your projects. Stitch markers are really helpful to mark your project in terms of stitches and rows, so it helps you count. It helps you mark specific points in the projects that you need to remember. Now these I don't think you really have to buy. They can be anything. They can be like a hoop earring, they can be a safety pin, they can even be a bit of scrap yarn that you've tied into a loop. Then you might want a couple embroidery or darning needles. These are really helpful for weaving in ends of yarn. Once you've finished your project, you might want to have those in a couple different sizes for thinner yarn and chunkier yarn. And then it's always helpful to have a measuring tape. They come in all different sizes and shapes. Mostly they're used for taking some sort of measurements, whether that's of your body or of other garments, and they can also be used to measure your gauge, which we will get to. Then a few optional notions that I don't think are really necessary, but you can look into if you want. Some small scissors. These are just helpful to keep in your case or have on the go rather than using like kitchen scissors. Some needle stoppers. These are only really important if you're working with interchangeable circular needles, but also most of the time they will come with individual needles or a needle set. And the last thing is a gauge ruler. These also come in different sizes and shapes. Mine looks like this, but you can also get square ones. These are just more accurate than a measuring tape, which kind of tends to bunch up. This is quite optional. You can also just use a tape measure. You basically just want something that is straight and measures very accurately. Moving on to the kind of yarn that you should be using as a beginner. All types of yarn are categorized by weight, which in simple terms just establishes how thin or thick a kind of yarn is. The weights that you should be looking out for as a beginner are DK, light worsted, Aran, and chunky. Anything smaller than DK will probably be too thin, and anything bigger than chunky will just be too thick to work with. Within the weight categories, yarn can be any kind of fiber. There are so many different types of yarn fibers out there. Some other really popular ones are alpaca, mohair, cashmere. However, I would generally stay away from anything that's too fuzzy because you will struggle seeing your individual stitches, and you'll also struggle undoing your work because anything fuzzy will create knots and it does not like being undone. Acrylic yarn is generally the cheapest here in the UK. It's probably the best yarn to use for practicing and for any non-wearables if you're looking to make little stuffed toys or home decor. The downside is that it is not natural. It's basically plastic, so wearing it is an absolute nightmare. You will get really sweaty and uncomfortable. Cotton is great because it literally has no natural fuzz, so it's really easy to see your stitches. However, it doesn't have a lot of natural elasticity, so it's quite hard to get an even tension. And then wool is kind of a very large term for a lot of different kinds of wool, but generally wool as an overarching term is the best option for wearables. So if you're looking to make jumpers, scarves, hats, it's easy to work with, and in most cases it will last you a long time. The downside is that depending on the kind of wool, it can be a bit itchy. As with everything else that I'm recommending in this video, I would encourage you to look for secondhand yarn. Look on eBay, on Vinted, on Facebook Marketplace, in charity shops and thrift shops, and just look for yarn that you like the look and the feel of. If you want some very specific yarn recommendations and you want to order something online, then here are some brands that are very beginner friendly. You of course have Hobby. All of their own brands are super cheap, super affordable. You've got the Friends cotton, which is 100% cotton. It's a DK yarn. The Friends wool, which is 100% wool and also DK weight yarn. And if you want to be a bit more fancy, the Merino Cares, a lovely merino wool that you can use. Again, it's 100% wool and a DK weight yarn as well. Then you have Drops. They're again really accessible, really affordable. They're available on most online yarn shops. They also have a much larger range of yarn blends. So for example, Drops Air is a 65% alpaca, 28% polyamide and 7% wool, and it's an Aran weight. So you've got a bit of everything in there. Then you've got Drops Alaska, which again is an Aran weight yarn and 100% wool. You've got Drops Lima, which is a DK weight yarn and is 65% wool and 35% alpaca. And Drops Nepal, which is another Aran weight yarn and it's also 65% wool and 35% alpaca. Another highly recommended beginners friendly yarn is Cascade 220, which is an Aran weight yarn and 100% wool. And Rico yarn has some good cotton options. You've got Baby Cotton, which is a DK weight yarn and split between 50% cotton and 50% acrylic. Or you have the 100% cotton yarn, which it says it in the name, is 100% cotton and also DK weight. Generally, I would just advise to stick to cheap yarn. It just means there's less pressure on you to complete a project, to do it really well. There is less at stake and you're just not wasting as much money when it inevitably will go wrong. And also a good thing to keep in mind is to stick with lighter colors because it will just be easier to see your stitches. So stay away from black, navy, dark green, anything like that. Then you'll also see on most skeins of yarn, there'll be a bunch of different information, which is super, super helpful as a guideline. So you can see here on the front, it says Aran. So this is an Aran weight yarn. It also gives me the fiber, so 90% acrylic and 10% alpaca. The reason why this is very important is because different types of fibers will react differently and drape differently. So a project that is made with 100% cotton will not look the same if instead of the cotton you're going to use a wool. So it's always very good to stick with similar yarn as the recommended yarn for a pattern or a project. You also have a bunch of other information on here. So you have the recommended needle and crochet size, and they are in relation to the gauge. We'll get to the gauge later on, but this basically means how many stitches and rows make up 10 centimeters in length and width, and this is achieved with the recommended needle and crochet hook size. You also have a bunch of care instructions on there, which is also good to keep in mind because different yarn fibers react differently to temperatures and wash cycles, but generally I found most yarns just ask that you do a hand wash. So you've got your needles, you've got your yarn, you know how to cast on and off, you might even know a few different stitches and stitch patterns, and you're now ready to learn a bit more and advance your knitting. I've made a YouTube playlist, which I will link down below, with all the kinds of beginner tutorials that I think you will need in order to succeed in basically any project that you're going to tackle. By now, you might have already adapted a knitting style, however, I'll go through them anyways. The most popular, well-known ones that I can think of is Continental and English. I personally knit Continental, most of my friends knit English. I think it really just depends on whose tutorial you watch in order to learn how to knit and just what you're most comfortable with. I find Continental knitting the most comfortable because I hold the yarn the same way that I do in crochet, so I was just naturally drawn to that technique. There is no right or wrong way, but it might just be worth looking into different ways that you can knit, just in case there's a different technique that you didn't even know about that you will feel so much more comfortable with in the long run. The most important things you need in order to start out knitting is casting on, doing a knit stitch, and casting off. There is basically only two types of stitches within knitting, and that is a knit stitch and a purl stitch. If you've learned the knit stitch, you can then move on to the purl stitch, and that's basically all you need to know. There is then like a bunch of different stitch patterns that are just a variation of how the knit and purl stitches are applied. So the most basic one I'd say is the garter stitch, which is where you knit every single row. You then have stockinette stitch, which is where you alternate one row of knit, one row of purl. And you also have the 1x1 rib, where you alternate the knit and purl stitch within the same row. Those, I would say, are like the three most basic stitch patterns that you need to know, and that are basically the only ones that I as an advanced knitter use. Like, I don't really go much beyond those stitch patterns. Then very important to know is troubleshooting and knowing how to fix mistakes. This is going to really advance your knitting. It's going to make everything so much more fun and less scary. So knowing what to do when you drop a stitch and how to fix that. When I figured that one out as a beginner, absolute game changer. And then also a little bit scarier, knowing how to frog your knitting. So frog or frogging your knitting basically means to fully unravel a row or whole section, then picking the stitches back up and re-knitting that. It can feel so scary to just take everything off your needles and have like open stitches. So there's a technique called lifeline, which really helps you drop the stitches without them just like being loose all of a sudden. Once you've kind of mastered all of those techniques, I think it's time for you to learn how to increase and decrease. There's a few different methods on how to increase and decrease. They all kind of depend on the kind of look you're going for or what the pattern calls for. And I think the best way, honestly, to learn those is by picking a project that needs you to do them. Everything else before this, I think you can kind of learn as a little swatch, kind of how you can see behind me. Just knit a square, a stockinette stitch or rib stitch, just to practice, you know, get it out of the way. You don't need to do a full project in order to learn a new skill. However, for increasing, decreasing, I think it is the most fun to just do it in the project itself. So if we're talking about garments, you'll need increases and decreases in order to shape something and make something fit. And as the name already implies, increased stitches will make something bigger and decreased stitches will make something smaller. I actually didn't learn a lot of these increase and decrease methods until I was confronted with them in a pattern. And I find it easier to learn these things in action because you can really see their use and their purpose rather than learning how to increase, but you don't actually know how it's applied or what it is used for. Then there are a lot of different techniques and methods within knitting that can seem incredibly scary when you start out. And I personally am going to advise you to not bother learning all of those. I think a lot of the time you need to encounter a certain problem in order for you to actually then care on how to fix it. Whereas like if I'm going to tell you all of these methods and things that you need to know, they're just going to go straight over your head because you don't know the context in which they might occur. However, two of the kind of most important things I think you should just be aware of as a beginner is gauge and blocking. Some knitters care about gauge, some knitters don't. However, gauge really matters if you are really specific with the way you want something to fit. So a pattern will give you a gauge that says 19 stitches by 20 rows, for example. And that means that across 10 centimeters occur 10 stitches and across 10 rows there will be 20 rows. A pattern might tell you to knit with a 4mm needle and that kind of yarn in order to get this gauge. However, you might then knit your gauge swatch with that 4mm needle and with that exact same yarn, and you might get 20 stitches and 21 rows. And that simply comes down to the fact that every single person knits differently and has a different tension. So the gauge is basically there to standardize the pattern. It is an annoying extra step that you have to do before you even cast on your project. However, it is just a matter of like routine and implementing it into your process. Whenever I now start a new project or follow a new pattern, I know that I'm going to spend the first day knitting a swatch, blocking the swatch, waiting for it to dry, and then possibly having to do it again in case that first swatch doesn't work out. I think when gauge doesn't matter as much is probably when you're knitting something oversized or you're not as bothered about the specific fit. If you're knitting an oversized cardigan or a jumper and you end up doing a few more stitches than the gauge recommended, your jumper will come out a bit bigger, but doesn't really matter because it's supposed to be oversized. Or if you knit a few less stitches and the jumper comes out smaller, it's still not going to be like tight fitting, like it will still fit you. Same with like a scarf. If the scarf comes out a little bit wider or a little bit thinner, it's not going to be the end of the world. When I think it does matter is when you're making things like a beanie. You know, you don't want the beanie to be too tight that you can't wear it or too big where it just falls over your eyes. And that also brings me on to blocking. Blocking basically is just a term for washing. So in the most basic terms, when you've knit a gauge swatch, you need to put it into some water, which will help the stitches and the fiber relax. With some yarn, it might not even make that big of a difference. With other yarn, it might really stretch out or really shrink in. That's why it's really important to block your gauge swatch, because you will know how your finished project will look after you've washed it. If you're making something that is like a home decor item, or you're making a beanie and you know you never wash your beanies, look, I'm not going to judge, then you don't have to bother. It's absolutely fine. But if you know you're going to wash your items at least more than once, block your gauge swatch, because you don't want to spend hours and hours and hours and days and weeks and months knitting a jumper just for you to then wash it for the first time and it massively shrink or stretch out and you can't actually wear it. There's different kinds of blocking techniques that you can look into. Like I said, I literally just put my finished project or gauge swatch into a bowl of like lukewarm water, let it sit in there for 20 to 30 minutes, dry it out with a towel, lay it flat, don't touch it until it's dry, and it will probably take a few days for it to dry. Beyond technique specific tutorials, there's also project specific tutorials which you can follow along. By the end, you would have made a finished project. One that was very highly recommended is the step-by-step sweater by Florence Miller. This is a raglan construction, and I have found when I looked at project tutorials that they are all raglan constructions, so that's a good one to keep an eye out for when you're making your first project. That raglan seems to be the most beginner friendly. I think even more beginner friendly than a raglan jumper is a sweater vest. I remember actually one of my very first projects was a sweater vest, just because you don't have to do sleeves basically, but you're still kind of confronted with having to do increases or decreases to create this sort of shaped armhole, to create a shaped neckline, picking up stitches around the arms and the neckline, creating the rib stitch pattern. So a great one for that is the Open Trails vest by Ashley Lillies. This designer has video tutorials for basically all of her knit patterns, I want to say. Some of these do look a lot harder than others. Like, I wouldn't really advise you to be doing a cable knit jumper, but if you see like a really basic kind of stitch pattern right at the bottom, there's a beginner friendly balaclava tutorial, then these are really great to follow along. Now, video tutorials are a great way to learn how to knit a proper project, because it is just so much easier to have someone show you visually how something is supposed to look. But a majority of knitting is following written patterns, and there's a bunch of great beginner friendly patterns and designers, especially designers who film video tutorials alongside their written patterns. I think that is the best way to learn how to read patterns, is by having the written copy and the video tutorial alongside each other, so you can compare and visually see how something looks when it's written out. I wanted to go through a few of the beginner friendly patterns that are out there, starting with the classic rib hat by Pearl Soho. This is a free pattern, and like the title suggests, a classic hat. Hats are a great beginner friendly project because there's little at stake. You know, you are spending a chunk of time knitting it, but it's not like working on a whole jumper. So if the hat doesn't work out, that's fine. You can just try again, and I'm sure the second attempt will turn out much better. You have the Roomy Raglan by Jules Efterfield. Again, a free project. This is a lovely sort of oversized raglan jumper. Like I said before, I think vests are one of the best beginner friendly projects. So you have the See My Vest pattern by Maker Store. Again, a free pattern. You have the Balla Bonnet by Simstrick, which is a super trendy and fun, cute little headwear piece. You're using quite a thick needle and chunky yarn, so you have that sort of instant gratification from finishing a project. Then there are a bunch of patterns by Petite Knit that are very beginner friendly, and we're kind of moving on to some of the beginner friendly designers that you might want to know about. Petite Knit is very well known, and she is well known for a reason. All of the patterns come with a lot of video tutorials, and there's a lot of hand holding throughout her patterns. There's the Louisiana sweater, which is another raglan construction, and it's a very thick kind of chunky look. There's the Olga sweater if you want to learn how to knit with stripe, and it's a bit of a sort of thinner, finer look. And the Nova sweater, which has this kind of round top yoke design as well. Lots of people recommend the Sophie scarf, so I have included this as well. I personally don't know if I would recommend this to my friends who start out to knit. The stitch pattern itself is very simple. It's just a garter stitch. However, you are dealing with slightly more advanced skills like an I-cord selvage edge, increases and decreases on a very specific and large scale. You have to really keep track of counting and your stitches and your tension, and I think it can get quite frustrating for beginners. That could also just be me. Lots of beginners seem to be absolutely fine with it and love making this. Some other designers that you might just want to have a look through their pattern catalogue is my favourite things, knitwear. There's lots of great sort of basic jumper and cardigan designs. Naked Knit, which also has lots of basics but with a bit more of a modern fun twist. Ozetta, who is also very well known and has lots of great basics once again. And Easy as Knit, who has lots of very fun patterns as well as some video guides alongside those. Another great tool to familiarize yourself with is the advanced search feature on Ravelry. Ravelry basically has all the patterns on it and is the greatest resource for you to find patterns. However, on the advanced search, you can filter down the search results by free. So whether you're looking for a cardigan or a hat or anything, once you apply the free, all the patterns that come up will be free. It's the same as with the needles and the yarn. The less money you spend, the less pressure and frustration there is for you when things don't work out. I asked on Instagram for some other questions that people had in regards to learning how to knit, which I thought might be quite helpful to go through because I'm sure there's some of you watching who will have the exact same questions. The first one was about how you handle when you have to frog a big part of the project or start completely over and dealing with that kind of frustration that you feel. Frogging things is good and making mistakes is good and is actually important, and most of the learning will come from those failed projects. I've personally learned way more from the mistakes that I've made than from the successful projects. If you're frustrated, you are not having fun, and I would just say to start a new project. If you're starting the same project over and over again, you're not enjoying it, no one is forcing you to finish it. You can always come back to it, but most likely you won't, because once you start knitting something that you actually enjoy, you will not want to go back to something that you don't enjoy. It's as simple as that. I can definitely relate to that frustration, and it might not feel like it in the moment, but you would have learned so much from that project that is causing you that frustration, and you are going to take that learning to all your future projects. How do I get better tension and make my increases less noticeable? Tension mostly comes with time and practice, unfortunately. However, there are a few things that you can do to try and improve it. You can experiment with different types of knitting. So if you're knitting English style, you might want to try continental and see if your hands prefer holding the yarn that way. You can change the yarn that you're working with. Some types of yarn are just a nightmare to get the tension right. Even until most recently, I really struggled knitting with 100% cotton. My tension was just all over the place, so I just avoided it and knit with a kind of yarn that I much preferred and found easier to get my tension right. And now at this point, I've practiced so much that even cotton yarn I don't have that many issues with anymore. When yarn shopping, how can I tell how it will look without trying a bunch of different yarn? As well as patterns, Ravelry has a massive library of yarn, so you can search for the kind of yarn that you're interested in using and go on the project tab, and you will see a bunch of different projects that people have knit with that yarn, so you can see how it looks in different stitch patterns and different projects. You can kind of see the drape of it as well. However, other than that, unfortunately, you do just have to try the yarn. It is all about swatching different types of yarn, trying it with different size needles, because at the end of the day, you do want to get a feel for the drape. Do you have any tips on knitting sleeves? So sleeves are typically knit in the round, which I think as a beginner can be quite difficult, so you can just knit them flat and seam them together at the end. That's how I did all of my sleeves when I started out, because I just got annoyed with working in the round. Unless your sleeve is really oversized, it's really hard to get the tension right with every single stitch. If you don't want to knit your sleeve flat, always specifically tells you in the pattern to knit it in the round. There's a method called magic loop where you pull the cable of your needle through in a certain way so that the tension on your left needle is always the same. The last stitch of every row is always so loose. After I saw this question, I actually kept an eye out on how I deal with my final row, and you can just pull your yarn a bit tighter after you knit the first or the second stitch. And I realized I actually do this with every single row and every single project, but I do it so subconsciously now. So I'll knit 1 or 2 stitches and I just pull my yarn a little bit tighter to make sure that those stitches are really tight. You don't want to pull it too tight where the needle struggles to like pass the yarn over, but you can just manually do it. And once you get into a habit like I have, you will just do it subconsciously with every single project. Does knitting speed change? Generally, yes. Once you're used to working your stitches, you've got your tension under control, you will knit without even switching your brain on. Your hands will do all the work and you're not even thinking about it. It's like riding a bike. You're riding the bike, but you're not actually thinking about pedaling or steering. There are different knitting styles that are quicker than others. I think generally continental is considered to be the fastest. So you can always try that if you are really keen to knit fast. But I think also some people just knit faster than others. What do you do when your gauge isn't right? If you're trying to get 20 stitches, but the swatch that you made gave you 25 stitches, you've got too many stitches on your needles. So you need to up your needle size in order to make your stitches bigger so you get less stitches. So you just go up a needle size, make another swatch and continue to do so until you meet the 20 stitches. Now, if you're getting less stitches, so you're only getting 16 stitches, but you need 20, your needle size is too big. So go down a needle size, make another swatch, and you'll be able to fit more stitches onto that needle. If you're also using a different yarn to what's recommended in the pattern, you could also just be using the wrong weighted yarn. So if your yarn is too thick for that project, you won't get enough stitches. And if your yarn is too thin, you'll most likely get too many stitches. So if you don't want to change your needle size too much, you can also just change out the yarn that you're using. What's the best thing to knit as my very first project? Now, some people say the best thing to knit right at the start is a beanie or a scarf. Others say to just dive straight in and make a jumper. I think generally the advice to knit what you genuinely love and want to wear and use is the best advice. I remember when I started out, I got the advice to make kids clothing because it's smaller and so you finish the project quicker. I don't have any kids. I don't know any kids. So that was completely useless to me, and I went straight in to knitting jumpers and cardigans and vests, and even though they didn't look great, I was able to practice the exact thing that I now still make and wear and I'm much better at. So do totally knit a scarf if that's what you want to make, but don't just knit a scarf because people are telling you it's easy. Why does my knitting look so bad? I wouldn't put so much pressure on yourself. Don't expect the first project to be looking perfect. Just keep practicing and with time things will look better. I think it's really important to understand how to identify your problems. For example, identifying that you accidentally keep dropping stitches and then looking up tutorials. You are not going to know exactly everything that you need to know in order to make your knitting look good until you are confronted with those issues. So you kind of do want to aim for things to look bad because otherwise you won't know how to not make them look bad, if that makes sense. I'm struggling to follow tutorials. What should I do? Now, like I said, there's many different ways on how to achieve the same effect. And you might just need to follow a few different tutorials with the same method in order for you to find an explanation that you understand. We all learn things differently. We all understand things differently. And you might have just not found the right person to explain something to you in the best way that you understand it. Where do I ask for help? Sometimes it is really hard to even know what your problem is because you haven't got the terminology for it yet. So the best thing to do is to join forums, Facebook groups, go to local knitting groups and meetups and speak to people in real life and show them your knitting, because it will be so much easier for them to identify a problem that you're having and to give you advice. Your local yarn store employees are also there to help you. They are going to be the most knowledgeable people you have access to. You can take your knitting into the shop to them and ask them for help. You can bring your pattern in and ask why something isn't working out, and they will most likely be able to help you as well. Okay, and with that, we've come to the end of the Beginner Knitting 101 guide. I really tried to fit as much information as I possibly can into this video without overcomplicating things and overwhelming you. So I hope I was able to strike a good balance there. All the information that I shared in this video, I've also put into a Google spreadsheet, which I'll put down below so you can access all the information, all the different links and video tutorials there as well. The tutorial YouTube playlist will also be linked down below. I'm very excited for you to be starting this journey. And if anyone else has any recommendations or any tips and tricks, do leave them down in the comments below. But that is all I have to say to that. So thank you so much for watching, and maybe I will see you in another one of my videos. Goodbye.